My mom had a stalker for years. She was maybe in her early 30s. I was about 3 and my brother was around 1 when this started. My dad would leave for work in the morning, and as soon as he was gone, the calls would start coming in. She'd answer the phone and some guy would be saying all these horrible, sadistic and sexual things about what he wanted to do to her. She was beyond frightened and didn't know what to do. Sometimes, the caller would describe what she was wearing at that very minute, or describe what she was doing. My parents were struggling financially, so they wouldn't just up and move. But my mom started spending more and more time at my dad's mother house when he was away for work. The cops got involved, but they couldn't trace the call. Finally, they were able to save up enough money to move. I was about 6 by this time. The phone number was changed and enlisted in the phone book. This was around 1988 when everyone still used landlines. My mom never got another scary call, but she had nightmares about it for years. When I was little, I remember going into her bedroom in the morning and she would be sobbing into her pillow. I didn't understand it at that point, but she explained it later in life, that she would wake up from a nightmare and just shake and cry. A couple months after we had moved, the cops informed us that they finally caught the guy. It was our next door neighbor's 19-year-old son. He had been in the military but was discharged due to severe mental illness. I guess he was put into some sort of a special security home that specializes in mental health. The lead investigator said that the son was absolutely obsessed with my mother, and they found a box in his room full of a bunch of photographs candidly taken of her when she was out in the garden or playing with us kids in the yard. It chills me to the bone when I think about it now. Anything could have happened to my mother when my dad was at work, and I would be too young to help her. When my dad was around 17 years old, he decided to go camping with about 8 or so of his friends. This took place in the Wisconsin forest. When they got to the site, they decided to split up to collect firewood in groups of 2 and meet back at the site in around 20 minutes. One group wasn't back right away, and so those 2 were a couple. They just assumed that they were playing around in some bushes and cracked a couple jokes about it. After around an hour, they decided that they should probably go look for them and headed off to search in the area they had been collecting woods. When they got to the place that the couple was supposed to be collecting woods from, they saw behind a bush part of the girl's bloody shirt, and the man's shoes were lying scattered around the scene. They quickly rushed back to their car so they could drive to the park's ranger office to report the incident, which was about 5 miles away. However, they found out that their gas had been siphoned, so they had no choice but to walk. On their walk back to the office, they saw a semi pass by with one driver and 2 faces pressed up against the window, which they believed were their friends begging for help. The 2 friends were reported missing and have never been found to this day. I used to take care of a developmentally disabled man in a community protection program. He had to be kept away from people because of his sudden violent outbursts. His parents were rich and bought an old farmhouse on 10 acres or so, which was about 4 miles out of town. All that so that he could be away from the public and not forced into a psych ward. For 4 years I worked there on a 56-hour shift. I would come in on Sunday evening and leave Wednesday afternoon. There were 2 of us on these shifts and we were both supposed to be there the entire 56 hours. But because we were supposed to be the most senior trainers on staff, we would take turns going home on 1 or 2 of the nights. After 3 years of being in that house, I had become comfortable with it, despite it being so isolated and kind of creepy. I would always stay up and watch TV until around midnight. My client was always locked in his room around 8 p.m. One night, about 12:15 in the morning, I turned the TV off and pulled the covers over myself to try and get some sleep. There was one window in the staff room and it faced the back of the property and was about 6 feet off the ground. I had just started drifting to sleep when I heard the most blood-curdling women's scream from right outside the window. I popped up so fast that I nearly lost consciousness and had to steady myself in the doorway while the screaming continued and then faded away. I grabbed a flashlight from the laundry room and threw open the back door, eliminating the area outside the window, and there was nothing. I ran along the perimeter of the house and saw absolutely nothing. I then went to check up on my client in his room. I kept knocking on the door but there was no answer, which was quite typical of him, to be honest. However, I was just freaking out at that point. I watched the sun come up in the next morning, desperately glued to the TV, trying to distract myself from what had happened. All of the people I worked with were much older than me, and there was no good reason to play a prank like that in the middle of January in eastern Oregon. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it still bothers me to this day. In my early 20s, I was home for the summer from college. My mother and brother had just headed out for a few days trip to visit colleges that my brother was interested in. This meant that I was to take care of my father. When it came to my dad, something was clearly wrong, but we couldn't tell what. He had Parkinson's disease, but it was more than that. Anyway, we figured that I could handle him. It was during this time when I came to realize that something in his broken mind hated me with a passion. He wouldn't listen to anything I said. Now, I admit I was irritated enough already, so I wasn't doing a terrific job either. But even simple things like getting him food was an hour-long ordeal that ended with us shouting. One time, I called my mom on the home phone because at least he would listen to her. I gave him one phone and I was on another, yelling at each other through it even though we were 5 feet apart. My poor mother was trying to referee from a few hundred miles away. Finally, my dad hangs up his phone and gives it to me, and I think to myself, oh, he's done. Thank God. But then he tries to take the still active phone from my hand, which I refuse, and that's when it happens. It gives me chills to this day. A change came over him. It was subtle, but he stood straighter. It was like for a moment someone else was in his body. He stared at me, and in the most calm, cold voice I have ever heard, he said, "I'm going to kill you." There was no emotion behind it. There was no energy. He said it as a fact. I was stunned. My mom heard it over the phone. As I stood there, paralyzed, her voice broke through in a whisper and said, "Baby, run." I threw the phone at my dad, rounded the corner and grabbed my keys. It was pure instinct for me at that point. I had to run, because if I stayed there, no one knows what he was going to do to me. My dad didn't really remember what happened. He was confused as to why I was suddenly gone. I have no idea what went on in his head at that moment, but I feel like I stared into death back there. My father, in his increasingly clouded mind, knew something was wrong when he was told of what happened, and he just felt utter shame. But it wasn't the end of the horrors, not by a long shot. As his mind further broke, he inflicted a lot more mental and emotional abuse on us. After that night, I couldn't bear to be in the same room as him. The final straw was when he attempted to assault my mom. I stopped him right before he did, which he then assaulted me. We had him committed into a mental psyche ward and then put into a home with hospice care. My mom, brother and I started the long recovery. Now, years later, we are better. I don't sleep with a knife by my bed anymore. I don't wake up at any little sound at night. And to be honest, I have forgiven my dad too. I miss the man he was, not the monster he became. We still talk about it and all the other events with my father's insanity. It's a way for us of processing the grief and damage. We are better, but the scars will never fully go away.